So the next panel is on discount rates. What is a discount rate anyway? You've already heard about discount rates, and so we have the CalPERS chief actuary here, a current economics professor from the GSB, and a former economics professor. Both still very active, or Bill Sharp, even though he's retired, is very active. And Scott Tarando and Jeremy Buell on the other end. And so Scott's going to lead off, and then we'll go to Jeremy, and then we'll end up with Bill Sharp. Great, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Oops. All right, thank you, Joe, and welcome everybody. Appreciate the invite here. Thanks for Joe having me here at the friendly confines of Stanford on this discussion here today. So what is a discount rate? I'm going to talk about what the discount rate is in terms of how CalPERS interprets it and how we apply it in our line of work. To start off, a quick little summary. We have approximately $335 billion in assets today. Our return, 11.2 last year, and the last 5-year return, 8.8, and you can see we have the 10, 20, and 30-year returns. And you can see that CalPERS has returned well over 8% for the last 30 years. Taking a look at our historical allocation, asset allocation, this is a pretty interesting chart, and there's a lot of information going on this, so let's kind of step through this. If you look, you can see the solid blue line that starts out, and it jumps up really high during the during the 80s, and then comes back down. That's a 10-year Treasury rate, and it starts out early. You can see we started out right around 4% in the 60s, jumped up to over 14% during the 80s, and it's come back down recently to the around 2%. The dark line that starts out similarly around 4%, goes up and stays level and then slowly works its way down, is the CalPERS discount rate. And that's the discount rate that we've been using to calculate the liabilities and the contribution amounts for the plan. If you look at the background, those colors kind of indicate the asset allocation that CalPERS has used over the years. Back in the 60s, we were 100% fixed income. 100% fixed income, return was around 4%, and the discount rate, again, was around 4%. And you can see kind of as the 10-year Treasury jumped up over the years, the discount rate kind of followed along, and then slowly as the discount rate, while the discount rate stayed steady, we had a decrease in the Treasury rate. Kind of point out, at the same time that was happening, if you take a look at the background, you'll notice that what CalPERS did is we've increased our equities at that point. So as the return on our 10-year Treasuries dropped, we increased the proportion in our assets allocated to equity. We later on added inflation assets, public equity, real estate, and so forth. Now, some of the questions people sometimes come to us and ask us is, why would we increase our discount rate when Treasuries went up, but we didn't decrease it when it went down? I'll point down to the background behind this, going on behind the scenes. The returns were based on, and the discount rate's based on what we consider the expected rate of return, the investment rate of return. And just because the 10-year Treasury dropped in recent years, our expected returns haven't. So what do we do when we look at our discount rate? How do we decide that? We take a look at the capital market assumptions. We look at the short term and we look at the long term. We don't simply just go out, look at the asset allocation, pick the long-term rate of return, and say that's our expected rate of return. We look at the short term, we look at the long term, we look at life expectancies. We take a look at our expected benefit outflows. And then what we do is we given our outflows, we discount those outflows both with short-term and the long-term expected rates of return, and we come up with an equivalent discount rate. So based on our expected cash flows, we determine our rate. It's not a short-term rate, it's not a long-term rate, it's expected based on our cash flows. Now, we've also had some questions about the terminated agency pool and why do we have different discount rates? Well, let's start out with we have a number of plans at CalPERS. The PERF that gets the most attention, right now we're at 7% discount rate. We have a number of other pension plans in the PERF as well. Judges 2, legislator. Those are all at different discount rates. The legislature plans at 5%, the judges 2 plans at 6%. Those different discount rates are based on the expected asset allocation that those plans have. For determining an agency pool, there are several things going on that give us a different rate. First of all, we use an immunized rate because the goal of the terminated agency pool is to protect the assets of the plan members. So we reduce all risk for those members. Also, you need to consider that at this point, there is no future payments coming in from the employer. We don't have the ability to go out and collect additional payments if the returns are lower than expected, if people live longer, if any of those conditions happen, we don't have any recourse. So what we need to do for a terminated agency pool is to kind of bring everything forward to today and reduce risk. For the terminated agency pool, we use a 10-year combination, 10-year, 30-year treasury rates. We look at the duration of the liabilities for the plans, and we calculate the discount rate based on those expectations. Some of the key differences, I think, you got to remember, for terminated agency pool, there's no recourse. For all the other agencies, it's an ongoing system. We plan on the agency being around for the next 20, 30 years. We expect that the difference between what you would call the termination liability and the funded liability that we have is what we expect to return in gains through investment returns. And since we do evaluations every year, we get to look at whether the expected returns met our expectations or not. If they're not there, we can turn around and we make adjustments. We make adjustments, small adjustments each year up or down, depending on the experience of the plan and where things are headed. Recently, we've dropped the rate from 7.5 down to 7%. And this has caused a number of increases in contributions. I think it's been talked about earlier that contributions are increasing. We see contribution rates doubling for some plans over the next 5 years. It's just a consequence of bringing down that discount rate, bringing down the expectations on expected investment returns, and additional funding. And one also thing to keep in mind is when you look at CalPERS, you got to remember we have over 1,500 employers. It's not just the state, it's just not the schools. We have a number of employers at different funded ratios, different contribution levels. And so our big challenge on our end is trying to strike a balance between getting all the agencies funded up to their current level, at the same time trying to manage the wide variety between the plans. Okay.
All right, so Jeremy Bulow.
Look, you've heard a fair amount of actuarial stuff, which as you can see, have seen already, has the potential to be infinitely complicated. Fortunately, the economics is really simple. What does the employer owe a worker as a pension? One way to think about it is, let's say that worker's employment ends today. We're only trying to figure out what do they owe as of today. What does the employer owe if the worker either quits or is terminated without cause today? That under the the rules of the pension plan, the worker is owed a certain stream of future benefits. Second question, you figured out that stream of benefits. How should you figure out the so-called present value of it, the amount of the liability? If we think of this as a relatively high-quality liability, if we think of the state of California as providing its employees with a benefit that is of comparable quality to what a high-quality life insurance company would provide to its employees, the way to think about it is to say, well, what would it cost if we went to one of these life insurance companies and said, take on this liability for us, how much money do you want? And that's all there is to it. And on that basis, as Joe said, the state of California, the CalPERS plans are about $1 trillion underfunded, which compares to $128 billion a year in general fund revenues. So, we're kind of 8 years of tax revenues in arrears. And CalPERS does the same calculation, as Scott was referring to, in its termination liability. They say, let's say you have a pension plan and you want to get out of CalPERS, switch in the future to simply paying your employees on a defined contribution basis and not have to deal with any of this mumbo jumbo in the future, and you'll know what it's costing you. How do they calculate it then? They basically do it on this insurance company basis. So what we've got is you might have a liability that on the insurance company basis is $200. And CalPERS will make that calculation. They'll also do an actuarial calculation and come up with a number like $100. And they'll say, well, you only owe $100, but because we're going to make 7%. And you say, fine, well, I'd like to get out of the thing. Can I do that by paying $100? They say, no, it's $100 plus a $100 prepayment penalty. So, if you want to get out of it, it's $200. So the $200 is the real number. Now, there's this issue that comes up where people talk about the government being a good risk bearer, somehow being able to smooth things out over many years and kind of make an excess return. And all this implies that somehow or other the government can kind of offer a better rate of return than the insurance company. I frankly think that's crazy and has got nothing to do with any of the reality that we've seen. The insurance company that's traded on the stock market, regardless of whether they invest in stocks or bonds, the insurance company tends to be owned by the people who own the stock market, on average pretty wealthy people who are pretty good risk bearers. The pension fund is a liability of the state. The stakeholders in the state's gains and losses are all the people in the state, many of whom are not so well off financially and who can ill afford it if there are losses. So the idea that somehow or other the state can magically make 3% extra relative to what you would get from the insurance company because it's a better risk bearer, I think is really odd. The way to think of the actuarial calculation is they do a lot of pyrotechnics to come up with a number which you could think of as being the comparable to, on a credit card company, them giving you a minimum payment. So it's not what do you need to pay your balance in full. It's what is the minimum you have to pay. And over time, as the interest rates have gone up and down, and as they've suffered losses from time to time, they have made various ad hoc adjustments to essentially manipulate that payment number under great pressure from the employers. Just looking at this slide, which it's a little less uncluttered version of the one that Scott put up, you could see that as we went from the 60s to the 80s and 90s, as interest rates went up in the economy, CalPERS said, well, you know, we can, if we're promising people to pay a certain amount of money and the interest rates in the market that we can get on high quality bonds has gone up, we can use a higher discount rate. And they moved the discount rate up. And that was reasonable. So you get to 1985 and you could get 8 or 9% or more on 30-year bonds, and assuming that you could make 8 or 9% on a long-term investment was reasonable. But they did not do the symmetric thing on the way down. As the interest rates started to go down, employers didn't want to have to contribute more. Similarly, if you think about the dot-com bubble in 2000, what happened? So around that time, the plans were, on an actuarial basis, highly overfunded. So what happened? There was pressure from the employers to say, oh, you know, the plans are overfunded. We don't need to contribute anything. Let us not contribute anything. Let us increase benefits without putting in more money and take advantage of the overfunding. What happened? Within a couple of years, and a couple of years where the stock market was not quite so good, there were single-digit losses in 2000, 2001, all of a sudden you're way underfunded. What do? Do they say, okay, now that we're underfunded, we have to do things the exact opposite? Not at all. Let's just look. So here's the school contribution rate history. So what happened? You could see they get to around 1999, they bring the rate down to 0. They say, oh, we made a lot of extra money. We can bring the contribution rate down to 0. And they keep it there for 4 years. And then what happens? They say, whoops, the bubble burst. Okay? We've put in much less than the long-run average for 4 years, and now we're back to normal. How are we going to make that up? Well, you could see that they didn't actually make it up. They raised the contribution rates back to the original level, but they never made up for all those years where they didn't put in anything. And now that's coming home to roost. So, you can look at the schools plan. Already they're scheduled to double the contribution rate in the next 6 or 7 years. They're just going to have to because they owe so much money. And, you look at the Highway Patrol, what's happening? Highway Patrol currently, for every $1 we pay in salary, we pay another 48.7 cents into the pension plan using a 7.5% discount rate. If we used a 5.5% rate, which is an understatement by the way any economist would calculate it, or the way any insurance company would calculate it, we'd have to be putting in 89.6 cents. And again, those numbers are going up over time. So it's really bad. I'm going to stop there and give Bill a chance to talk for a few minutes, and then maybe we can have a more general discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.
Minutes. Excuse my voice, I've had a little bit of laryngitis. I have no presentation, I have no slides. Partly because I was pretty sure everything that I might say would be said. So let me give you a little bit of a personal background. I started looking at pension issues in the 80s. Some of you may not remember the 80s, but and have been intrigued by it ever since. More to this point, the point of today's talk, or talks. In 2011, the city in which I live, Carmel by the Sea, you should all, no, you should not come visit. There are too many people there already. Asked me to head a little group for the city looking at the city's pension issues. And we did. And we found that it was possible at that time to terminate our plans at a safety plan and miscellaneous, and send CalPERS some money, and they would then cover all the accrued benefits, what you've heard before. If everybody quit tomorrow, benefits earned to date, they would just pay them as necessary. And if we did that, CalPERS would value those future payment obligations at the then rate of 7.5%. And they'd add 10%, for good measure. But at the time, the city was able to borrow at 4.5%. And it seemed to us that if you can borrow at 4.5% and in effect invest it at 7.5%, that was a pretty good deal. So we were happily preparing our report, final report, making that one of our 3 recommendations. And I was actually in Europe, and I got a call, I guess it was an email, from the state actuary with whom we'd been working saying, we just changed the rules. We put out a new circular, and now if you want to terminate, those liabilities will be valued at, I think at the time it was 3.5%. It was basically based on a combination of the rates on treasuries, regular treasury bonds, and TIPS, treasury inflation protected securities. And one of the things, just inter alia, about the slides you've seen, most of the CalPERS pension liabilities are real. They're adjusted almost 1-for-1 for inflation. So you really need to be looking not at the interest rates on nominal treasuries that pay nominal amounts, but rather the treasuries that pay inflation-adjusted amounts. And those rates have not been as variable as the rates you've seen. And so there's an issue there that needs to be dealt with. In any event, back to my story, we had our report we thought prepared, terminate the plan, arbitrage, borrowing at 4 or 4.5%, and in fact get 7.5% on your money. And it turned out that was no longer possible, nor is it to this day, as Scott has mentioned. If a plan terminates, CalPERS estimates what it would cost to pay those benefits over the future years, adds on 7% for good measure, but discounts it at the current Treasury and TIPS rates, matched to the duration of your particular liabilities. And what I want to argue today, and I think what you've heard from Jeremy and in effect from other of the economists, that's the number that's the one you ought to think about as your liability. Now in Pension Tracker, we use that number, or a variant of it, I think Joe would say, which we call the market value of the liabilities. And to go to Jeremy's analogy, that's roughly what you would pay if you were to defease them. And many corporations have been doing that with their defined benefit plans. You go to a good, high-rated, safe, hopefully, insurance company and say, how about you pay these benefits and we'll write you a check. What is the magnitude of that check? And that's what's called, in CalPERS land, the termination liability. And in the actuarial reports, CalPERS provides the agency, Carmel, with a hypothetical termination liability, which is an estimate of that number based on current Treasury, it's long-term Treasury rates. However, in the last year, they have now gone to providing 2 such estimates, one based on Treasury rates a year ago, I think it is, and the other on Treasury rates. It's over a 2-year period, isn't it, Scott?
And so
That's right, to get a set of range. And those numbers, as I recall, the last reports range from 2-something to 3-something%.
1.75.
1.75, that's close to 2.
Like this.
And what was the high one, Scott?
I can't remember.
Yeah, okay.
We're right
Do
around
you remember?
1.5, 3.5, somewhere in that.
Something like that. So you can see those numbers. What you will get if you terminate will, of course, depend on what those numbers are at the time of termination. But as Jeremy and Josh and others have said, that's what economists think the value of your existing promises to your employees is really worth. Because if you really believe you're going to make those payments, or somebody is, those are safe. And in the marketplace, Treasury securities, which presumably are safe, sell for those amounts. And that is what they are worth. If they're not safe, well, that's a different discussion. So that issue of what is the present value of your liabilities, I would argue, you've heard economists generally argue, if you're really going to pay them, it's the comparable amount you would pay a good insurance company to defease them, or the amount it would cost you to buy a set of treasuries that would basically match those payments. Now, that's separate from the issue of how much you should pay this year to CalPERS if you're Carmel. And I think it's important to separate those issues. How much should you pay down your debt is separate from what is your debt. And we economists, and I think you will find almost all economists who've thought about this will take this position, is the termination liability a la CalPERS, or basically the value discounted at the rates on comparable treasuries and tips. And again, remember, these are generally pretty much cost of living adjusted. So that's my main point. I would say also, it's the first time I've ever seen an audience watch that video. I should tell you that there was a period I was recovering from a surgery and I wasn't sleeping very well at night. And so that video and a couple of others resulted. And you can figure out whether or not I was on drugs at the time. But so in any event, that's about all that I think I should bother you with. I'm happy to be involved in Q&A.
Great, thanks. Thank you. All right, so questions? Questions, yes. Could you repeat the question as you understand it? I think I got it, but I'm not.
I didn't quite hear it all. The question, I think, was why can agencies terminate and not go, and the employees can't go?
I thought what you said was why can't an agency go back for additional funding, or is that, or why can't CalPERS go back for additional funding? Is that so? In other words, take us. The city of Loyalton, or the town of Loyalton, recently exited CalPERS, right? No? We're saying no. Okay. But so if it's someone who's exited the system, I mean, CalPERS can't impose. They can't go back. They have a set rate that they have to pay to remain in the system. Otherwise, they're correct. Richard, why don't you go ahead and jump in? Right.
The question actually is voluntary termination. If it's screwed up, we assume all liability for the employee going forward. I think what your question is, you don't get the return, you get back on that. That's no. Where they've left the system because we screwed them up. Royalton's different because Royalton's, I want to make sure we're on the same page. So your question, voluntary termination by a local government, they get screwed up on salary. Now we're done. And your employees are paid. They get their benefits. Now your question is, if you want to turn anything in half, whatever they do.
Oh, I see. Okay, so in other words, if
Right.
if CalPERS somehow doesn't
No.
earn even that amount, what happens?
No, once an agency terminates, it's on CalPERS. CalPERS owns that liability. That's why we do have a 7% load currently. So when plans come in, we have a load for mortality and deviations on the investment side, but there's no recourse from our side in terms of going back to employers. Once employers terminate, they walk away, and our contract with them are done. You gotta remember, we're the administrator. So our job is to take the funds from the employer and pay the employees. We don't have funds of our own. So when an employer leaves, we need to take all the funds available to support those benefits for those employees. And at that point, there's a break. The contract is done. The contract is complete. And we don't get to go back to employers and say we had bad return. They don't come back to us and say you had good return, we want more money back. It works both ways on that side.
And I might say, a number of you've probably read of private employees, corporations have defeased. Typically, they've gone to DC plans for new employees, and they've gone to Prudential or someone and made the same kind of deal. We'll cut you a check. You pay the benefits. Thank you very much. And I don't know whether or not, if Prudential doesn't pay, there's any liability back on the corporation. I don't know. Does anybody know?
I don't know.
I wouldn't think
That's the
so.
idea of,
I wouldn't think so, but
Yeah, Jeremy, did you want to add?
yeah, the state of California has other liabilities. We borrowed money for all kinds of other things, that are on our balance sheet. We've borrowed in the private markets at whatever, 4% or something. When we do our balance sheet, we don't say, well, these are unfunded liabilities, but, if we invested in a carefully chosen selection of mutual funds over the long run, we can make 8%, and therefore the liability is really only 60% of the amount that we borrowed. It's really the same thing. Yeah.
Question over here.
it's both because typically some is paid by each party. The employer makes a contribution and the employee.
Employees, right now, if you take a look at a lot of the employee contributions for classic members are set in statute. It says employees will pay 6%, 8%, and that's what they pay. Regardless of what the normal cost is, regardless of what the unfunded is. I think possibly when there was the rate contributions, employees were still paying money. So if you go back several years, what happens is the employees will pay the same amount regardless of what the normal cost is or what the unfunded is. Pepper came along, and what it was a split in the normal cost for Pepper employees, and it was supposed to be split 50-50. So for employees hired after January 1st, 2013, the normal cost is split 50-50. I will make a point that employers do have the ability to have cost sharing with their employees. Nothing precludes them from going out and having the conversations with the members and say, I want to change what you're paying. That conversations can take place. Nothing precludes it from happening today. If the employers want the employees to pay more, then they have to have those conversations with the unions and the employees and have those tough conversations. Right now, it's established somewhat in statute on what the minimum they pay. The maximum can be determined on an employer by employer basis.
And in some cases, you even have the converse, where the employer will pick up part of the quote employee contribution under the Pepper.
Right.
Right.
Right, so just so folks who are watching this, I'm not sure if they heard the question, but the question is really about the shared risk and the shared amounts that are paid by employees and employers, right? And then Jeremy, I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, and just, going forward, here's an area where the economics might even be a little more complicated than than what's on paper, or what people might think with a naive reading, say, of the California rule. Look, we have a big deficit. We're promising people more every year than we're likely to be able to, than we can give them under the current tax system. There's a shortfall. Somehow that's going to be made up. It might be made up by employees receiving lower salaries in the future, in part. It might be made up by us getting really lucky on our investment returns. It might be made up by having some fairly significant tax increases. Somehow or other, between all of those things, it may be made up by part of the liability being defaulted upon. Somehow between all of those things, the difference is going to have to be made up. And you can't just look at what somebody's contract says. You can't just look at the California rule and say, this means that it's all going to fall on the taxpayers, and the taxpayers are going to be paying a large tax increase. Because, the California rule might say that the pension formula is fixed in stone, but it doesn't say that the salary is fixed in stone. And, if the state finds that if the state and the local governments find that they have to start putting in an extra 30 cents on every dollar in salary into the pension fund, they're going to be saying to workers, look, we have a balanced budget requirement, we've got to lay people off, we've got to cut salaries and so forth. And that's actually a lot of what Joe's recent report is about.
Well, and in fact, it's pretty, well, I shouldn't say it's pretty clear because I only did 3 school district studies, case studies, but the ones that I did, it seems apparent that what's happening is that as pension costs are beginning to rise at school districts, and again, they're just seeing the beginning of that, they are beginning to cut back on salaries, either total compensation and or the number of employees. So that's exactly what's happening in those school districts I looked at least. I thought I saw a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ed Mendel, Question for Scott, if I could. Why did CalPERS lower the discount rate for the terminated agency pool in 2011? Was there a concern that because of the big investment losses that some of the employers might declare bankruptcy, as happened a year later with Stockman and Sandberg,
I can't, the question was, why did CalPERS
Lower the termination rate
change?
or change the formula? So why did CalPERS change the formula for the termination rate?
the discount rate for the terminated agency pool. It had been 7%
Right. I wasn't 100% sure on why the rate was changed, but I can say that from my perspective, I think all the risk, CalPERS was taking on all the investment risk that should have been on the employer side. And then there was a recognition that actually CalPERS was taking on risks that they shouldn't be taking on. And that risk really belonged with the employer in terms of the expected investment returns. And so that the change was implemented to take risk from CalPERS and move it to the employer where the risk really should have been. Because if you think, remember, CalPERS is basically there to pay out the benefits. We're not an insurance company. We're not the payer of last resort. We're not there to fund benefits with money that we don't have. And so what we did is we made an adjustment to transfer that risk and make recognition that that risk needed to be reflected when employers leave CalPERS.
So Bill Sharp,
Yeah,
this relates to your personal experience, I think.
At the time, there were very, very, very few pensions in that pool. I mean, it just, a few. It was a tiny little pool. But there were committees in Carmel and other cities at the time looking at this issue. And I think we were not the only one who thought, well, invest, borrow at 4.5, invest at 7.5. That's a pretty good deal. So I believe, I have no evidence, this is just speculation, that CalPERS said, well, this is not just a sleepy, tiny little piece of something over here we can ignore, but this could cost us, or cost, as you say, our remaining employers money, and somehow or other got religion. That's my speculation.
But so I mean, essentially, it was CalPERS recognizing the risk that was
I have
inherent
no
in that.
evidence.
But I think that's what
Speculate.
Scott said as well, more or less, right? It was a recognition. Sure. You said it was the risk?
Thank you. Thank you.
But it was a
It's really lovely for an economist to have a hypothesis actually proven to be true.
So, but Richard,
That's right. No, I understand. No, I mean,
But-
because it should have been higher to begin with. Yeah.
but so Richard, I guess the question is, what was it that made you recognize that there was that risk? Why did you think there wasn't a risk on Wednesday, but on Thursday you decided there was a risk, or when that happened? But yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Right.
No. Yes. And we still have a very high market liability, but not as high as Palo Alto. You can find it all on pensiontracker.org.
Okay. Yes, right here.
Hi, Randy Zuback, CalPERS. I just want to make sure this kind of basic point is understood by the audience, and maybe Scott can elaborate since I don't have a microphone.
Yeah.
We believe there are multiple ways you can measure pension liability. As was mentioned, we do measure termination liability for all of our agencies and disclose that if an agency is considering that. For funding purposes, for determining our contribution, we use a different discount rate. And Jeremy, I think, made the comment that we got our hope for tremendous investment return, but in reality, if we get our expected 7% and continue to give the contributions, we are collecting exactly what we need to pay those benefits.
Well, that's not right.
No, it's right. What he said is right.
Then they're still short the 30-something% that they're underfunded,
Oh, yeah, no, that's true.
right?
But
It-
will be in the future, yeah. Yeah.
Contributions that earn 7%. We're not talking about earning 15% every year. And I want to make sure that's
Yes, but just to be clear also, when you started having a 7 or 8% discount rate, it was at a time when it was possible to buy bonds for 30 years that were paying, 9%. And it was reasonable to assume that an organization like CalPERS could earn 8% over 30 years. Now that the bond rate is 3%, as you say, the only way to do that is by throwing a lot of stock market risk onto the taxpayers, who are probably not quite as good at risk bearing as the stock market in general.
So would you suggest that CalPERS assets should all be invested in bonds?
I didn't.
That's a separate
I didn't
issue.
say it's a separate issue. I'm just trying to calculate what the liability ought to be, what the liability is.
For what purpose?
Understanding what's, again, I'll go back to my video. You know, you owe what it would cost you to defease those liabilities. You have issued, hang on. You have issued to your employees and retirees bonds that are purportedly safe, right? You have. And those bonds in the marketplace carry a value. And the value is the number that we've been talking about, our market value. Now, you have chosen to put not that amount, but a smaller amount in a risky portfolio. Now, there are issues that on another day we could talk about. You know, it's as I've alluded to, it's deceptive to look at nominal rates because these are mostly real obligations, cost of living adjusted. And the real rates have not varied as much as the nominal rates. There were periods of huge inflation in that graph that Scott showed you. The real rates, to the extent we know what they were, because there weren't not real bonds in those periods, did not vary as much. And you really ought to be discounting your real obligations by real rates, which is to a major extent what happens if you actually terminate. When you actually terminate, CalPERS looks at your liabilities, uses a combination of TIPS and nominal treasury bonds that purportedly matches the duration and the real aspect of it to really find out what the market thinks those obligations are worth. That's this termination liability, or in the reports, the hypothetical termination liability now range. We're just arguing that's the economic value of what you owe. How you finance it, what money you collect, what you invested in is a separate issue. It's not an unimportant issue, and we can all talk about that. I'm just hoping that you will all agree that that termination liability, what we call the market value of the liability, is the germane economic measure of what the obligation is. And it's a big number.
Yeah, and to get to your point, look, a defined benefit plan is basically a defined contribution plan where the beneficiaries only get to invest in one kind of asset. That asset happens to be deferred annuities sold by an insurer who doesn't have to meet the usual funding obligations of a normal insurance company and is backed up by the person's own employer. Now, if we were starting de novo, what I would say to you is just like a defined benefit plan, when you earn money in a defined contribution plan, when you earn money in your defined contribution plan and you say, I want to put $1,000 into the Vanguard Index Fund, your employer deposits $1,000 and pays that liability each and every year, as opposed to saying, okay, we'll credit your account, you've now got $1,000 and we'll make it up some other time, it's okay if we're underfunded. I'd say, yeah, let's pay it off every year. Now, we're in this situation where we're $1 trillion in the soup in California. Now, obviously, we're not going to make that all up overnight. And there are complicated issues, including complicated game theoretic issues, involved in funding decisions. If you're the employers, and there's a question of what you want to negotiate for, if you're the union, those things are really beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. talking about today is simply, let's take at face value what you always hear from CalPERS, what you always hear from the state, that these liabilities are just as good, if not better, than what somebody would own if they had a claim against a good private insurance company. On that basis, how bad are things?
Yeah, one thing that many of you probably know, if not all, some employers who have defined contribution plans are including in their offerings purchase of a deferred annuity. So the employee can say, all right, I'll take this money, thank you very much, and I will have you, please send it to Prudential to give me a little piece of an annuity that will start when I'm 65, and then we'll pay, and maybe it has cost of living adjusted. So in effect, it's possible to create a DB plan in a DC clothing. When you do that, guess what the valuation of that obligation is? It's just what we're talking about.
Sure, go ahead, go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
You use the example of a benefit that an insurance company would say it's worth $200, CalPERS would say $100.
CalPERS would say it's $100, but if you want to pay it now, you have a $100 prepayment penalty.
Okay, it's 200, yeah.
Fine.
It's different.
CalPERS gets its 7% return.
You've
How
overfunded.
much money do they need to pay that person's benefit?
You're absolutely right, but I mean, marketplace,
Yeah,
the marketplace values a dollar of stock at $1, right? And it values a dollar of bonds at $1. That stock has a higher expected return than the bonds do, but the bond return is safe. That's why, even though its future return is lower, it's valued at $1.
Right, but the employer is taking on that risk. We've admitted. The question is why should an employer who's going to be around for the next 20, 30 years decide to eliminate all their risk today and pay everything today when they know they can get expected returns?
That's fine, that's a separate issue.
But then, if it's a separate issue, then how can you say that we should ignore all those expected returns? The return for
No, but
PERS.
I'm just saying, in the marketplace, value depends on expected return and risk. It does not depend only on expected return.
Right, an employer has
That's
that.
in the marketplace, every day, investors tell us,
Scott, do you
that's
think-
how they value
Do you think
things.
we should do this with the other debts of the state of California? Money, when we go out and we borrow, $1 billion to build some fraction of our high-speed rail system, and we borrowed at 4% for 30 years, should we say that, well, that's really only a $600 million debt, just like in Bill's video? Or should we say, well, we borrowed $1 billion, we pay it back tomorrow, it's going to cost
See,
us.
but you can't sit there and, for the pensions, that's not one. You didn't go out and you didn't say this is exact. This is, right now, it's based on estimates.
I think Bill's
It's based on
analogy was
assumption.
pretty exact. I don't know how he could have had it more exact.
We're out of time.
Let's go with one other
Yeah.
question here.
So great panel, we're totally in the soup of this. Good job.
So we've totally confused it. We're academics, that's our job. That's,
The way I think about it, the way we think about San Jose, tell me why we're crazy. We're gonna pick some risk. Maybe it's the risk-free rate, we're gonna go way out to 12%. We're gonna build a portfolio, we're gonna try to achieve that.
fine.
We're actually picking a fairly low risk rate because we don't want to bankrupt San Jose. We're gonna run the experiment, I'm an engineer. At the end of time, 30 years, 40 years from now, we will get a result. We will either have exceeded expectations, good luck for us, or not, or failed to meet expectations. When you put the driving function of intergenerational equity, I'm not gonna kick the can down the road, but I'm not gonna make people pay too much now, you get a real discount.
Okay, first of all,
And
let's,
always said how we implement is
no, I understand. First of all, let's be clear, the duration, for Palo Alto at least, using CalPERS recent numbers, the duration for Palo Alto is 12 years.
Yeah.
That is, all those benefits, weighted by value, all the other stuff, it comes out at 12 years. So it's not 30 years, it's 12.
We do all different times, because there's lots of different promises.
I understand, but I mean, I'm talking about the average across the whole schmear
Right.
is 12 years. So, and in 12 years, you may not get whatever number you're talking about.
I may get more, I may get less.
You may get more and you may get less. And in the marketplace,
God will tell us in the future what the discount rate should have
Well, I wish you'd tell us now, but
Maybe, do you think it'd be a good idea for the city to borrow money from other sources and invest in the stock market and hope to get a risk premium? Or,
But is, I
you're
mean,
right.
but essentially that's the same thing, right?
I don't know what I'm not going to say what the answer to that is, but I think the answer to that is kind of the same as the answer with the pension fund. It's the same issue. It's the same city, the same liabilities.
Invest it all in tips. Would you do that?
I do. I don't invest everything in tips
Why don't you?
because, because there's some possibility of earning more, blah, 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 blah.
Then, so that's what the decision,
But my duration is probably a little less than yours.
but you're not advocating that we invest it.
Bill's,
I'm not saying anything about what you invest
look,
in.
and Bill's a really much better risk bearer than the average person for a couple of reasons. And first of all, he's a famous guy in finance. His net worth is higher than the average Californian. And second of all,
How
if
do
you
you
look
know what my net worth is?
I don't, but I'm speculating. If you have a nice house in Carmel.
I do. That's true.
And the second thing, the second way in which people become good at risk, what makes somebody good at risk bearing is that they're able to save for a rainy day. So when they have an up, they're able to put the money aside so that when they have it down, they can smooth it. That's what makes you, one of the things that's important for being a good risk bearer. A lot of people, your friends are probably pretty good at that. If they made a bunch of money during the tech bubble and then their income went back to normal after 2 years, they probably still had 90% of what they made. You look at the state government, the city governments, no. They are not good at smoothing. More money comes in, it gets spent. You saw what happened with the contribution rates. They went to zero. Benefits went up, contributions rate went to zero. A windfall came in, it was spent right away, and then all of a sudden, bad times, tremendous pain. Oh, we can't make it up. We'll use the CalPERS system where if you have $15 million in returns that are below expectations, we'll divide that up first by 15 and then by 30, and then we'll only put away an extra $60,000 the first year to try to make up the 15 million, which at that rate you'll never make it up. So, the fact that they're not good smoothers means you've really got to wonder about this idea that the city and the state are such great risk bearers.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. One thing I want to mention is that CPER just posted last week a paper that Jeremy did that deals with this issue, actually sort of its intersection with the California rule. I'm going to say it's an easy read. It's only about 16 or 17 pages, I think. So if you go to cper.stanford.edu, go to publications, you'll see it there, and just search under his name if you don't find it. If you need a direct link, just let me know or let us know, and we'll get it to you as well. Or email Jeremy directly as well. All right, so we'll bring up the next panel. We're going to try to keep this to about 45 minutes, and we'll take a lunch break. Thank you.